The song lights are not on.
So I'll turn it on.
There you go. Can you hear me now? Alrighty. To the rest of the world watching Spain during the Spanish Civil War, while they did not know it, they were looking into their own futures of World War II. Extreme political ideologies and social ideologies, coupled with the problems of becoming a modernized country, all came to a head in 1936. What started as a failed military coup quickly turned into class warfare, religious strife, and mass genocide, leading to a 36-year-long fascist regime. So what caused the Spanish Civil War? The causes of the Spanish Civil War can be explained through Copeland's theory of dynamic differentials, causing grievance narratives throughout Spain due to the volatile nature of Spanish governments and social groups, coupled with the lack of a monopoly of violence, as well as multiple myth-building complexes. Before I start the speech, I think it's important to explain what dynamic differentials is. Dynamic differentials is the idea that states that are falling in power are more likely to act aggressively than states that are rising powers. For a modern-day comparison, look at Russia invading Ukraine. Russia has been in declining power for over 30 years, and their invasion of Ukraine is a hardline policy to try and stop their downward spiral. While dynamic differentials is traditionally not about internal conflicts, by imagining the different social classes and political affiliations inside Spain as different states, it is easy to see why conflict was inevitable. In the 13 years leading up to the Spanish Civil War, Spain went from a constitutional monarchy to a military dictatorship to a semi-presidential liberal republic called the Second Republic, which itself is split into three phases going left, right, and another left. As a result of these changes in the balance of power, all the different social and economic classes of Spain went through waves of gaining and losing economic and political power, fueling grievance narratives. In September of 1923, Miguel Primo de Rivera, believing that civil unrest in Spain was caused by the Cortes or the Spanish Parliament, took it upon himself to orchestrate a coup, dissolve the Spanish Parliament, and had King Alfonso name him prime minister. The Rivera dictatorship was a nationalist authoritarian regime and tried to unite Spain under the motto country, religion, monarchy. During Rivera's reign, he increased the power of the military, the financial and landowning members, and the bourgeoisie. Due to Rivera's over-reliance on the landlords and his nationalist mentality, he significantly worsened economic inequality, failed to implement agrarian reforms, and strongly suppressed the Catalonian region. He also failed to modernize Spain with the rest of the European world. As a result of this economic disparity, many working-class Spanish became increasingly politically active and began calling for the return of the Republic, and in 1929, succeeded in removing both Rivera and King Alfonso once they both had lost support of the military. When the Rivera regime lost control of the military, it failed to secure a monopoly of violence. This idea of monopoly of violence is explored in James Ron's Frontiers of Ghettos, who talks about how the more institutionalized areas of the country is, the less violent the populace will be. Zones of intense power prevent nationalism from developing to its most virulent proportions, but at the margins of state authority, extremism flourishes. The basis of Ron's argument is that when a state controls the monopoly of violence, little conflict is seen, even in oppressive regimes. And in the areas that are on the periphery of state control is where extremism and violence emerge. Ron writes that the ways to achieve this institutional setting is through empirical sovereignty, which is the state's actual physical ability to control territory, expropriate the means of violence, administer the population, and shape social and political life. So while the Rivera regime did escalate the socio-economic grievances that eventually caused the Spanish Civil War, due to the suppressive nature of the dictatorship, these issues were held under control through his monopoly of violence. And when he lost the military, he lost his empirical sovereignty and his monopoly of violence, and was then forced to abdicate. And then these problems were then inherited by the Second Republic. As Gerald Meeker writes, the fall of the monarchy brought to the fore with a vengeance all the dangerous and divisive problems of an invertebrate and underdeveloped society, issues that have been contained or submerged by the dictatorship: class conflicts, regionalism and separatism, clericalism, and economic educational policy. The agrarian question, the role of the military. Once the Second Republic was formed in 1931, newly elected left-wing Prime Minister Manuel Azana began implementing sweeping reforms. These reforms set into motion the rise and the fall of the powers in Spain. The military, the landowners, and the church, who all experienced support from Rivera's regime, began to lose their power. And Azana raised the wages of workers, retired surplus generals, and granted the Catalonian region virtual autonomy. Azana believed that the Catholic Church was the root cause of Spain's problems. Aside from the army, Azana considered the Catholic Church as the institution most responsible for Spain's backwardness. The Catholic Church, which ran all state schools in Spain, was removed from their role in education, and all state funding to the church was removed. So while other myth-making complexes will be mentioned, there is no stronger myth-making complex than the symbolism of the Catholic Church. According to Kaufman's Modern Hatreds, the core of the ethnic identity is the myth-symbol complex, the combination of myths, memories, values, and symbols that defines not only who is a member of the group, but what it means to be a member. Under this definition, a person's attitudes towards the church could determine their ethnicity. And in Spain, the question of religion did cause a major divide. According to Spanish Civil War historians, Azana was the symbol for the Republic and the left. He became the revelation, later the personification of the Republic. So when Azana gave a speech in 1931 saying that Spain was no longer Catholic, it served to be a very strong message. When the personification of the left says that Spain is no longer Catholic, it forces the opposition party to take the opposite stance. Most factions of the left had already viewed the church as a symbol of oppression, resulting in attacks against the church being rather common. This combination of churches being attacked, along with Azana's claim, led the right to believe that they were under direct attack from the government. So what was seen through the build-up to and during the actual civil war was the right believing that they were participating in a holy war. By their negative response to Spain's religious problems, they gave the conservatives in the right a rallying point defense of religious rights that had an emotional appeal beyond calculation. The domestic and global Catholic Church sided with the right wing throughout the buildup, further validating the right wing's holy war narrative, and blamed the eventual civil war on the Second Republic. According to the letters of the Spanish bishops in 1937, it was the lawmakers in 1931, and then the executive power of the state with the practice of its government. There were violent and continuous attacks against the national conscience, the rights of God being abolished and the church persecuted. Our society remained weakened in the legal order in the most substantial part of its social life, which is the religious. However, Azana's reforms, both economic and social, also changed the balance of powers, giving power to the working class and Catalonia. However, these actions disrupted the historic powers of Spain while also alienating many Catholics. This switch in power from Rivera to Azana formed grievance narratives in these communities that historically have never been experienced. This galvanized them in the 1933 election, and they appointed far-right Prime Minister Alejandro Lerroux, starting the right phase of the Second Republic. Alejandro Lerroux, who was reliant on the elite class, undid all the legislation and political gains acquired by the left during the Azana regime. Lerroux lowered the wages of workers, restored the church's role in state education, nullified the autonomy of Catalonia, and restored the promotions of the generals. This greatly infuriated and frightened the increasingly revolutionary working class, a working class who just saw the rise of Nazis in Germany and believed that this was the rise of fascism in Spain. In general, between 1935 and 1935, both in urban and rural working classes felt themselves to be under sustained attack. This political shift back to the right is when war became inevitable. So in accordance with dynamic differential theory, the public who had been granted equal power to that of the elites saw their newfound power declining, and this is when open class conflict began to break out. However, this isn't actually the Spanish Civil War. That was started 3 years later. However, during this period was the Asturias miners' strike. Sometimes referred to as the prelude to the Spanish Civil War, the miners' strike was spearheaded by the Asturias Socialist Miners, a well-armed group of socialist, communist, and anarcho-syndicalists. Empowered with the myth-making idea that they were at war with fascism, the Asturias miners called for an overthrow of the new republic in favor of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They gained control of southern Asturias for a month, killing their class enemies and burning down churches. To stop the miners, Lerroux called on Francisco Franco to suppress the region. Franco used brutal military tactics, put Asturias under martial law, allowed his soldiers to commit several war crimes, including torture, rape, and public executions. Understandably, Spaniards were outraged over the brutal repression of the Asturias region, and the left wing demanded new elections to remove Lerroux, who in his defense actually did not order the execution of these miners, and he actually ordered the military to cease further executions, but as a result of myth-making, Lerroux was seen by many to be a fascist tyrant. New elections were called, and Azana was put back in power, starting the second left phase. This moved the balance of power back again to the workers, away from the church, and most importantly, away from the military, and one General Emilio Mola Vidal. For any state to fend off civil conflict, the state must have empirical sovereignty, to have a monopoly of violence, to quell rebellions, and other internal threats. But even if a country has a strong military, When the people controlling the military aren't loyal to the state, they fail to have their monopoly of violence, which is precisely what happened in Spain. After the first election of Azana, General Emilio Mola was one of the generals who was forced into retirement and naturally developed a strong hatred against Azana and the Second Republic. Once the right-wing government and Leroux were given power, Mola was given the position of military commando in Morocco. With the return of the left-wing government and Azana, Mola was demoted and recalled from his position in Morocco and given the low position of a garrison commander. Feeling threatened by the return of the left wing, Mola began plans for a coup and enlisted another general, Francisco Franco. The most important thing to understand about Franco is that he actually had no interest in politics. From the years of 1928 to 1930, Franco was the director of the General Academy of Saragossa. However, Azana shut down the military academy and demoted Franco to the Balearic Islands. While Franco had turned down other coups in the past, after the Asturias miners' strike and Franco's brutal oppression of the region, Franco became another example of myth-making symbol as he became a symbol of fascism and oppression, and he feared that Azana would make a symbol of him personally to further demilitarize Spain, leading Franco to join General Mola's coup d'etat. By examining the two stories of these generals, we can see how Azana failed to keep his monopoly of violence, despite Spain having a strong military, as well as other causes for the Spanish Civil War. The first is the grievance-based narrative seen in both General Mola as well as General Franco. This continuous demotions of these generals caused individual grievances and in a broader sense took power away from the military. Franco's fear of further demilitarization is seen in Copeland's dynamic differentials theory. States often accept high risks of inadvertent war when initiating crisis in order to mitigate a decline of power. While Franco had once been against the idea of a coup d'etat, he started to believe that the return of the Azana regime would result in the downfall of himself, the military, and ultimately cause a civil war. So while the irony of Franco believing the Azana regime would start a civil war and inevitably starting one himself should be noted, Franco and Mola planned to do a swift takeover of the Spanish government, avoiding a civil war. Franco and Mola's coup is an example of a hardline policy to try and stop what they believed to be the downfall of the military and of Spain. While Franco and Mola's coup did officially start the Spanish Civil War on July 17, 1936, Spain had already reached a tipping point in which civil war was inevitable. On July 12, 1936, a group of fascist gunmen shot and killed a socialist police officer. As a result, the police in Madrid asked the head of the monarchist, José Calvo Sotelo, to come to the police station. However, on the way to the police station, Sotelo was assassinated. While it is unknown who assassinated Sotelo, the common belief amongst historians is that it was the police who killed him, not for political reasons, but because they believe Sotelo organized the killing of another officer. However, this didn't stop Sotelo from being martyred by the right wing, who claimed it was the left wing who were planning to eliminate the right. These assassinations, accompanied by myth-making, led people to believe that there was no way for Spain's partisan struggles to end diplomatically. When the coup d'etat of July 1936 ended, the country was split between the left-wing Republicans and the right-wing nationalists. Both groups radicalized by their myth-making, the rising and falling levels of power, and the lack of a monopoly of violence. On March 28, 1939, Franco marched into Madrid, signaling the start of his fascist regime. Held together through his empirical sovereignty, securing his monopoly of violence, his control over myth-making, and securing the balance of powers in Spain. And to really drive this point home, I have an excerpt from a CIA document. Franco's power rests upon the army, the church, the phalange, and the conservative moneyed classes, groups which together dominate the bureaucracy, direct popular opinion, regulate all economic activity, and control the instruments of force. By assuring internal order with strong police and army forces, Franco has kept the property classes upon him for the protection of their interests. Thank you.